The neighbor did witchcraft on my brother out of envy, and now we look for a way to save him, but he doesn't want to go back. It all started 6 months ago. Julian had always been a strong, athletic, and good-humored boy. Since he was a child, he had excelled in soccer and athletics, and although he was never an outstanding student, he had charisma and an energy that was contagious to anyone. But from one moment to the next, it began to change. First, it was small details. He stopped going to the gym, started sleeping in, and lost interest in his friends. My parents thought it was a phase, maybe stress from college or some sentimental problem. But I knew him better than anyone, and what I saw in him was not sadness. It was fear. I remember the first time I noticed him really upset. It was a Thursday night, and we were having dinner.
If you like this video, stay until the end, like, subscribe, and activate the bell for more videos.
Julian barely touched his food, something very rare for him. I watched him play with his fork, absent, staring at the table. "Is something wrong?" he asked in a low voice. He was startled and looked at me as if he hadn't heard me coming. His eyes had deep eyes, and his skin, once tanned from training, was pale. "No, I'm just tired," he replied. But I was not convinced, and even less so when, that same night, I heard him murmuring in his sleep. We slept in separate rooms, but the walls of our house were thin. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I paid closer attention, I noticed that it was whispers. I got up, intrigued, and walked to his door. It was ajar. From there, I could see him in his bed, his face turned to the wall and his body rigid. His lips moved, uttering words he couldn't understand. "Julian," I whispered, pushing open the door. As soon as I said his name, his body tensed suddenly. Then, he slowly turned to me, but what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes were open, completely blank. His mouth twisted into a terrifying smile, but it wasn't his. It was a forced smile, as if someone else was controlling her. "What are you doing awake?" His voice sounded strange, hoarse than usual. I was paralyzed. I felt a knot in my stomach, a sense of imminent danger. But I didn't want to scare him anymore. "Nothing. I only heard you talking in your sleep." Julian blinked several times, confused. His expression changed. "Me? No. I wasn't saying anything." I tried to hide my uneasiness and told him to go back to sleep. I returned to my room without saying anything else, but as soon as I closed the door, my heart began to pound. Something was very wrong. The next morning, my brother didn't remember anything about what had happened. But with each passing day, her episodes worsened. Presence in the house. As the weeks progressed, Julian began to change even more. He lost weight, stopped talking to us, and spent sleepless nights, locked in his room. But the worst thing was when he started saying that someone was watching him. "He's here," he said to me one day, his eyes vacant. "It doesn't leave me alone." I looked at him, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Who?" "The neighbor." "But it is not her. It's something that's inside her." Those words took my breath away. Our neighbor, Mrs. Marta, was an elderly woman who had lived alone since her husband died. She had always been reserved, but kind. However, the last time I saw her, I noticed that something about her was unsettling me. There was something in his gaze, something empty, dead. Since my brother started with his problems, I noticed that she stared at him every time she saw him on the street. Once, I even saw him stop in front of her house, paralyzed, while she watched him from the window with a crooked smile. "Mom, I think we should take Julian to a doctor," I said to my mother one night. She sighed, tired. "Your brother is just going through a bad time." No exaggeration. But I knew it wasn't an exaggeration. I confirmed it days later, when I heard strange noises in the early morning. The ritual in the courtyard. It was about 3 in the morning when I was awakened by a metallic sound. I got up, confused, and looked out the window. My room had a view of Mrs. Marta's patio, and what I saw there took my breath away. The neighbor was in the center of her garden, dressed in a black robe. In front of her, a small altar lit by red candles. In the center of the altar, a wooden box with strange symbols engraved. But the worst thing was what I saw when I got closer to the window. On the box, there was a photo of Julian, with his eyes crossed out in black. I felt my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. Then, Mrs. Marta raised her head, as if she had sensed my presence. His eyes met mine, and I knew he had seen me. I ran to my brother's room, desperate. When I opened the door, I found myself sitting on the bed, staring blankly. His body was stiff, and his lips moved in an incomprehensible murmur. "Julian." I shook him, but he didn't react. Then, without warning, his body began to convulse. I screamed for my parents, but when they arrived, Julian was already on the ground, shaking and foaming at the mouth. Mom knelt next to him, desperate, while Dad called an ambulance. And then, the most terrifying thing happened. In the midst of his crisis, my brother opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "It's not her, it is what lives inside it. He loves me." After that, he fainted. That night, I knew something was terribly wrong in our house, and that the neighbor was not who she appeared to be. That night, after seeing my brother convulsing on the floor, after hearing his words whispered in a tone that was not his own, I knew that something bigger than us was occurring. Something dark, something perverse. When the paramedics arrived, Julian was still unconscious. Mom was by his side, crying and holding his hand. Dad and I followed them in the car to the hospital, in silence, with an unbearable tension in the air. I wanted to talk. I wanted to tell my father what I had seen in the neighbor's yard, but what could I say to him? That Mrs. Marta was doing a ritual with Julian's photo? What had she felt that something was looking at us from the darkness? They would take us for crazy. But I knew what I had seen, and if no one believed me, then I would investigate on my own. The first sign. After several tests, doctors said Julian had suffered an epileptic seizure. But my brother had never had epilepsy. There was no history in the family. He had never shown symptoms. When he woke up, he was weak, confused, and terrified. She's calling me," he whispered. "Who, Julian's?" Mom asked desperately. My brother closed his eyes tightly, as if he was trying to block something in his head. "I can't say. He is listening to us." The nurse suggested that he rest, but I knew he wasn't sick. Something else was going on. That night, while my parents slept in the hospital chairs, I walked over to Julian's bed and gently shook him. "Julian, 10 cents really. What did the neighbor do to you?" My brother looked at me with glazed eyes. It wasn't her. It was what she brought. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "That thing, the one that controls it. It's not human." I didn't know which respondent. My brother was on the verge of a panic attack, and although he wanted answers, he couldn't force it. "Fall asleep. We'll talk about this later," I said, trying to sound calm. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to sleep. I had to do something. The discovery. When we returned home, Julian locked himself in his room. My parents didn't want to push him, so they decided to give him space. But I couldn't sit still. That same afternoon, I slipped into the backyard and jumped over the fence that separated our house from the neighbors. The garden where I had seen the ritual was now clean, but the altar I had seen, he was not there. I searched among the pots, among the dried plants, and the disturbed soil. There had to be something. That's when I saw a wooden box, half buried next to the fence. Trembling, I pulled it out with both hands and opened it. Inside, I found Julian's hair and a rag doll tied with black thread. It was a mooring. A damn witchcraft job. Panic took hold of me. I closed the box and took it to my room, trying not to shake. I had to get rid of that. But as soon as I entered the house, I heard my brother's voice. "You shouldn't have touched it." I turned and saw him standing in the doorway of his room, his face haggard. "Julian, this is witchcraft. We have to break it." But he shook his head. "It's too late." His voice was a threat of despair. And then the light went out. The night visit. The blackout lasted a few seconds, but when the power came back, Julian was no longer in the hallway. "Julian!" I shouted, but there was no answer. I ran to his room. The door was ajar, and the air inside was freezing. When he entered, my brother was in the corner, trembling, with his knees pulled up to his chest. "Don't let her in," he whispered. My skin stood on end. What are you talking about? And then, I heard a sharp knock on the window. I turned sharply. There was something outside.
My heart was pounding in my chest.
I walked slowly to the window, feeling an indescribable fear. When I looked out, I saw the neighbor. He was there, standing in his yard, looking at me. He was not smiling. He did not move a single muscle. But his eyes were pitch black. I took a step back, feeling a lump in my throat. "Mom," I murmured, but my voice trailed off. The neighbor raised a hand. And then my brother screamed. I turned and saw him writhing on the bed, as if something invisible was holding him. His body arched, and a heart-rending scream came out of his mouth. I ran to him, trying to hold him down. "Julian, wake up." But his body convulsed with inhuman force. His eyes widened, and they looked at me, but they were no longer his. "You shouldn't touch it," he whispered in a voice that was not his own. A shiver ran through my entire body. Then, all the doors of the house slammed shut. The light flickered violently. The air became thick, suffocating. There was something in the house. I ran to look for my parents, but when I got to the living room, the figure of the neighbor was on the other side of the window. He was looking at me, and he was smiling. And then, the ceiling lamp exploded into 1,000 pieces. That night turned into a never-ending nightmare. The neighbor's figure, her pale face and empty eyes, lingered in my mind as the air in our house grew heavier and heavier. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know how to begin to explain what was happening. It all seemed to be taken from a bad dream, and I couldn't wake up. The lights in the house flickered every few seconds, and the air, thick and heavy, became almost unbearable. The neighbor's figure was still there, watching us, and even though she was outside, the evil she brought with her felt as if it were seeping through the walls. Meanwhile, my brother, still writhing in bed, was still fighting against what seemed like an invisible force holding him captive. I ran to him, but could barely take a step before something stopped me. An invisible force pushed me back, causing me to fall to the ground with a sharp blow. My head was buzzing, and my vision was blurring as I strained up. Fear had paralyzed me, but the feeling that everything I knew was crumbling was even more terrifying. I got up, without thinking, and ran to the window. The neighbor was no longer in her yard. He had disappeared. But I didn't feel relief, because I knew, deep down, that she was near. It always was. When I returned to my brother, I saw him still writhing, his eyes completely white, as if his soul was being torn from his body. On his lips, barely audible, he murmured words that he did not understand, but that filled the air with a strange echo, as if they came not from him, but from something much darker. Suddenly, a shrill sound broke the silence, a kind of strumming, and shadows began to emerge from the walls. At first small, like figures that glided quickly, but soon they became larger, more defined. And it was those shadows that looked at me. I couldn't move. I felt as if I was trapped in a dream from which I could not wake up. My body was frozen, but my mind was screaming, "Let me look at me." The shadows moved forward, sliding toward us. My brother stopped convulsing with regret. A deadly silence pervaded the room, and then, with frightful slowness, his head turned toward me. "You shouldn't go near the box," he said, his voice deep and guttural, as if thousands of voices were speaking through him. His face was no longer the same. He was distorted, deformed, and his eyes were pitch black, with no trace of humanity. My heart stopped for a second. It was him, but he wasn't. Something had possessed him. Something he could not comprehend. "Julian," I cried, drawing nearer, but something stopped me. An invisible wind pushed me backwards, forcing me to fall to my knees. My brother was still smiling, but it wasn't his smile. It was a malevolent smile, one I'd never seen in him. Then, one of the shadows approached me. It touched me. The cold ran through my body, and my skin was filled with a sharp pain, as if the hands of a spectral creature were ripping my life from me. "You can't save him." The voice echoed in my mind, coming from the shadow. A voice that was not human, but that seemed strangely familiar to me. It was the neighbor's voice. My mind, despite the fear, began to understand the magnitude of what happened. The neighbor was not simply a person. She was not an ordinary woman, and what she had done to my brother was not something that could be explained logically. She was a channel, a vehicle for a much larger force. At that moment, I remembered what Julian had told me days before, when he was just beginning to show signs of what was happening. I had mentioned something about the thing that controls it, but I didn't understand it at the time. Now it was clear. That thing was not only controlling the neighbor, but it was taking over my brother. The shadows became bigger, more tangible. Suddenly, I saw figures emerging from the walls, as if the house itself was coming to life. All of them looked at Julian, observing him with a devotion that could not be human. "It's too late." Julian spoke again, and his words were like a distant echo, as if his voice was no longer his. I couldn't stop looking at him. Terror was creeping over me, but at the same time, something inside me knew I had to do something. I had to save him. With immense effort, I got up. The shadows tried to stop me, but with each step, my determination grew. I ran to the door, and when I opened it, I saw my mother in the hallway, with a lost look. "No tickets." I shouted, but it was too late. My mother entered the room, and when her eyes met Julian's, the expression on his face changed. It was as if she had recognized him too, but in a way that wasn't human. It was late. The shadows no longer only surrounded us, but absorbed us. I could feel my body beginning to fade, my strength leaving me, but I didn't stop. I knew there was something I could still do. The neighbor, in a way, was at the center of everything. And as I looked at my brother, as I watched him succumb to that dark force, something inside me broke. I had to go to her. I had to stop it. I left the house without looking back, without even worrying about what I left behind. He knew that the neighbor was not far away, that her power had already extended beyond his house. My only goal now was to stop her, to undo what I had done. And as I ran home, I felt a part of my soul being lost with every step, but my will was stronger. I couldn't lose my brother. The time had come to face what we never imagined. What once seemed like a nightmare was no longer a nightmare. Everything had transcended into a reality so dark that I no longer knew how to react. My brother, or what was left of him, was beyond our help. But something inside me was still telling me not to give up. I had to find a way to save him, although in doing so, I might get lost in the process. I went out into the street without looking back. The neighbor had disappeared, but her illness was still here, in the house, in the atmosphere, in the air that she no longer knew whether to breathe. I decided to go to the old antique shop in the neighborhood, where rumors were spread that ancient secrets of black magic were known, and that perhaps someone could help me. Every step I took seemed heavier, and when the door of the shop creaked open, a wave of cold ran down my spine. "Looking for something in particular?" said a raspy voice. As I turned, I found a hunched man with eyes as dark as night. "My brother is under the control of an evil force. I need to know how to break the spell," I replied desperately, hoping those words weren't in vain. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared at me as if he were evaluating my words, my very soul. Finally, he walked to a table covered in dusty books and strange objects. There, in the shadows, he began to speak in a low and serious way. "What your neighbor did is not ordinary witchcraft. What you have in front of you is something much older. The spell they cast not only involved you and your brother, but your entire family. The entity she controls feeds on young souls, those who have not yet been marked by darkness. And the only way to stop it is destroying the fountain." "The fountains?" I asked, confused. "The neighbor is nothing more than a receptacle. The real threat is inside your home. It is there where that force feeds and grows, there where evil is rooted. You need to destroy it, but it won't be easy. To do so, you must confront the entity on its own turf, in the place where its power is strongest." "But my brother," I said with a broken voice. "Your brother is no longer in this world. The human part of him left when the entity claimed him. What's left is a soulless puppet, **** if you don't act fast. Your body will become a permanent receptacle for that thing, ****. The man paused. Every word I said froze me even more inside. But his face showed a determination that, although not reassuring, seemed to be the only hope. You have to go now. The force that pursues you will not wait much longer. I left the store without looking back, the man's words still echoing in my head. I arrived at the house with a feeling of heaviness in the air. Something told me that it was too late, that everything had changed. The neighbor was no longer there, but she could feel the presence of that entity lurking in every corner. I went inside, and the first thing I noticed was absolute silence. There were no lights on, and everything was in complete order, as if no one had lived there for long. But something was wrong, as if the very essence of the house had been corrupted. My breathing became agitated as I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, as if the house was reacting to my presence. And when I got to my brother's room, I saw what I was most afraid to see. There he was, sitting on the bed, motionless. His eyes, which were once full of life, were now empty, pitch black. His body was rigid, as if he didn't belong in this world. Around him, shadows seemed to move, sliding down the walls and floor. A dense energy floated in the air, difficult to breathe. Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural laugh. It was a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the house itself was making fun of me. I turned, and there, in the darkest corner of the room, the neighbor appeared. His face was no longer the same. It was deformed, as if something had consumed it from within. But, still, his eyes had that empty gaze, that expression of absolute control. She knew she was no longer human. It hadn't been in a long time. "I knew you were coming," he said in a voice that was not his own, but seemed a distant echo of something much older. "Give it back to me," I screamed with all my might, feeling fear turn into rage. I couldn't give up. I couldn't let my brother be lost forever. The irritating neighbor and the shadows began to move with greater intensity, surrounding me. He could feel the dark energy growing, devouring everything in its path. The air became denser, and the cold penetrated to the bone. The entity was close. "It's too late to save him," the neighbor said, her face twisted in a grimace of satisfaction. But at that moment, a glimmer of hope appeared in my mind. I remembered what the man in the store had told me. "Destroy the fountain."
No.
I shouted as I ran to the window, looking for the place where I felt the evil was concentrated. There, right in the corner of the house, a shadow larger than the others began to materialize. It was the true source of everything. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, and a crack appeared in the wall. The shadow rose, taking shape, and what emerged before me was something indescribable. A dark, gigantic creature with red eyes shining with terrifying intensity. He knew that this was the entity that controlled the neighbor. At that moment, everything began to collapse. The shadows surrounded me, and the house seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it wanted to devour us. But, with an effort I didn't know I had, I threw myself at the creature, hoping that some spark of light, might still save us. And then, when all seemed lost, a white glow appeared. He was my brother. Although his body was wasted, his soul struggled to get out of the darkness. "I'll save you," I shouted, and as I made contact with the entity, a deafening scream filled the room. The shadows dissolved, and the neighbor's figure disintegrated, taking with it the darkness that had invaded the house. The air cleared, and silence reigned again. But the price was high. When everything calmed down, I found myself alone. My brother was no longer there. He had been released, but the cost was his sacrifice. The house collapsed at my feet, as if everything that had happened had been a dream from which I would never awaken. And though the darkness faded,